Every epic tale needs a grand opening, and here comes ours. The story of Hannibal Barca, the boy who grew up in Carthage and swore to make Rome regret every single victory it had ever celebrated. Picture the Mediterranean world after the First Punic War. Carthage licking its wounds, Rome puffing its chest, and in the middle of it all, a mischievous boy with fire in his eyes. This isn't just a biography, it's a ride through dusty battlefields, elephants climbing mountains, and strategies so clever that modern generals still scratch their heads. Our journey begins not with Hannibal as the famous commander, but as a kid whose bedtime stories weren't about dragons or knights, they were about crushing Romans. He would grow up under the shadow of his legendary father, Hamilcar, and in a household where revenge was as common as breakfast. So buckle up. From the narrow streets of Carthage to the thunderous fields of Cannae, we'll follow Hannibal's path from curious child to master of war. And remember, this isn't just history, it's a roller coaster powered by ambition, elephants, and a lot of Roman headaches. Now that the curtain is raised, let's zoom in on Carthage right after the First Punic War, a city that looked like it had just gone 10 rounds with a heavyweight champion and barely crawled back to its corner. The once proud naval power had lost its fleet, paid crushing indemnities to Rome, and walked around with the collective mood of a hangover. The streets were still bustling with trade, but beneath the spice markets and shiny harbor walls, resentment brewed like an overcooked stew. Rome strutted around the Mediterranean like a schoolyard bully, while Carthage tried to smile politely through gritted teeth. Families like the Barcas didn't just stew in anger, they simmered with plans of payback. Hannibal grew up in this atmosphere, where even the fishmongers muttered about revenge while selling tuna. The whole city felt like a giant pressure cooker, waiting for someone bold enough to lift the lid and let the steam explode. And in this world of humiliation, debt, and stubborn pride, little Hannibal's destiny was being sharpened. Carthage might have lost the war, but it hadn't lost its appetite for a rematch. Spoiler, that rematch would be very, very messy. If Carthage was a pressure cooker, then the Barca family was the fiery chili tossed right into the pot. At the head of this household stood Hamilcar Barca, a man who could command armies with the same ease most people command their dogs. Tall, stern, with the kind of glare that could silence an entire marketplace, he wasn't just a father. He was the living embodiment of Carthaginian pride and Rome's worst nightmare. Hannibal grew up under his shadow, alongside brothers in arms, both literal and biological, Hasdrubal, the smooth-talking diplomat and strategist, and Mago, the energetic sibling always ready to follow orders, or start a fight if there weren't any. For young Hannibal, family dinners weren't about asking, "How was your day?" They were tactical briefings about flanking maneuvers in which Roman deserved the biggest headache next. This was a clan that didn't just sit around complaining about debts, they sharpened their swords while doing it. And as Hannibal listened, wide-eyed, he wasn't just absorbing lessons about family loyalty. He was inhaling a lifetime supply of grudges, ambitions, and the fine art of not backing down, no matter how big the Roman army might look. Hamilcar Barca wasn't the type of dad who read bedtime stories, unless those stories ended with Romans crying into their togas. To young Hannibal, his father was more than a parent. He was a walking battle manual, a man whose veins pulsed with strategy instead of blood. Hamilcar had fought Rome tooth and nail in the First Punic War, and though Carthage lost, he refused to let defeat become the family legacy. Around the dinner table, he didn't talk about kindness or patience. He talked about revenge as casually as some fathers discuss fishing. To him, Rome wasn't just an enemy, it was the monster under the bed, and only relentless discipline could keep it away. Hannibal grew up listening to these fiery lessons, where every lecture sounded like a pre-battle speech. When he dragged his feet during training, Hamilcar didn't scold. He reminded Hannibal that Rome wasn't going to defeat itself. This was parenting Barca style, equal parts affection and military boot camp. And under that iron grip, Hannibal's spark of mischief was slowly shaped into something much sharper, a burning vow to finish what his father had started. And then came the family ritual that would put any modern swear jar to shame. Little Hannibal being led by his father Hamilcar to the household altar. Forget promises to do homework or eat vegetables. This oath was about eternal hostility to Rome. Imagine a wide-eyed boy, barely tall enough to reach the altar, staring at the flickering flames while his father's booming voice declared, "Swear you will never be a friend of the Romans." It wasn't exactly the kind of pep talk you hear at a school recital. Hannibal placed his tiny hand on the sacred offering and, with the seriousness of a child being told to guard a secret cookie jar, vowed eternal enmity. The scene was half family bonding, half historical turning point. For Hamilcar, it was a way of passing the torch of vengeance. For Hannibal, it was like signing a lifelong contract in invisible ink. And while other kids were swearing to behave, this boy was swearing to one day make Rome tremble. The oath became the fire in his belly, the unshakable compass guiding his life. From that moment, Hannibal wasn't just a child, he was a ticking time bomb aimed straight at Rome. Childhood for Hannibal was less about toys and lullabies, and more about bruises, blisters, and battle drills. While other kids played hide and seek, Hannibal played try not to get trampled by the training elephants. His father's camp was the ultimate boot camp, dusty grounds, clanging weapons, and a schedule that would make modern fitness instructors cry. Hannibal learned to ride horses before he could properly swim, to throw spears straighter than he could skip stones, and to march for miles on rations that would barely satisfy a goat. Yet in all this hardship, the young boy grinned like it was an adventure. When a sparring partner twice his size knocked him into the dirt, Hannibal spat out the dust, laughed, and asked for another round. Every scar, every ache was proof he was getting stronger. The camp was a school where failure wasn't punished with grades but with push-ups or running laps around angry soldiers. This harsh upbringing toughened Hannibal into something more than just a general's son. It was forging him into a warrior in the making, a boy already rehearsing for the stage where Rome would be his lifelong opponent. All that bruising and boot camp parenting started to reveal something fascinating. Hannibal wasn't just tough, he was annoyingly clever too. While most kids were figuring out how to sneak extra bread from the kitchen, Hannibal was figuring out how to outsmart sparring partners twice his size. His stubborn streak could turn a simple exercise into a full-blown competition. If told to run 5 laps, he'd run 6 just to prove he could. If ordered to carry a shield, he'd carry 2, grunting, wobbling, but grinning like a mischievous fox. He wasn't reckless, though. Behind the stubbornness was a sharp mind, always calculating, always testing the limits. Even his father noticed that Hannibal didn't just fight harder, he fought smarter, finding angles, exploiting weaknesses, and turning setbacks into lessons. For his brothers, sparring with Hannibal felt less like practice and more like survival training. This wasn't just a boy destined to follow orders, he was destined to rewrite them. In the dusty camps of Carthage, between bruises and laughter, the raw material of a genius commander was already shining through. By the time Hannibal was learning his multiplication tables, if Carthaginians even had those, Carthage itself was busy multiplying ambitions across the sea. After licking their wounds from Rome, the city turned its gaze westward, toward the rich lands of Iberia. Gold mines, fierce tribes, and endless recruits. Spain was like a treasure chest waiting to be pried open. Hamilcar, ever the strategist, realized Carthage couldn't outmuscle Rome at home, so why not build strength abroad? Thus began the Barca family's Iberian adventure. For Hannibal, this expansion wasn't some boring political maneuver. It was the equivalent of upgrading from backyard practice to a full battlefield playground. He watched as his father negotiated with tribes, built new alliances, and set up training camps that doubled as recruitment drives. Spain became the Barca family's second home, with elephants stomping the soil and Iberian warriors swearing loyalty under Carthaginian banners. For young Hannibal, it was a front-row seat to empire building, and he soaked it all in. The message was clear. Rome may have won the last round, but Carthage was getting ready for the rematch, and Spain was the gym where they were training. Fate has a habit of turning family dinners into succession plans. After Hamilcar's sudden death during a campaign in Iberia, the Barca clan found themselves in need of a new captain for this rocky ship called Carthage's Spanish adventure. Enter Hasdrubal the Fair, Hamilcar's son-in-law, smooth talker extraordinaire. and the kind of guy who could win over enemies with charm before the swords even left their sheaths. Unlike Hamilcar's thunder and steel leadership, Hasdrubal preferred negotiation, diplomacy, and the occasional wink across a banquet table. Carthage approved, the army followed, and Iberia suddenly felt less like a battlefield and more like a business venture. For young Hannibal, still sharpening his skills and his stubborn streak, Hasdrubal was both a mentor and a reminder that war wasn't just about swinging swords. It was also about playing chess with cities and kings. Watching Hasdrubal at work gave Hannibal a front-row lesson in the softer side of power, even if he quietly thought, "This is cool, but I still prefer smashing Romans." And so the Barca family legacy rolled on, with Hannibal waiting in the wings, hungrier than ever. From the noisy training camps to the diplomatic banquets, one thing became crystal clear. Hannibal was no ordinary boy. By the end of his childhood chapter, he was already carrying more grudges than a Roman senator after tax season. The oath at the altar burned in his chest, the drills toughened his body, and the endless lessons from both Hamilcar and Hasdrubal sharpened his mind. He wasn't just shaped by Carthage's defeats, he was fueled by them. Hannibal stood as the living reminder that Carthage wasn't finished. It was just getting warmed up. Every scar, every stubborn smile, and every fiery glance was a sign that this boy would grow into a man who could make Rome sweat bullets. The world might still see him as a teenager running around dusty camps, but destiny was already scribbling his name into the margins of history books. Rome had no idea that its biggest nightmare was still a kid in training sandals, waiting for the day he would march across their front lawn. And so this chapter closes with a promise. Hannibal Barca, the seed of vengeance, was ready to sprout into Rome's greatest torment. Leaving Carthage behind, young Hannibal found himself on the road to Iberia, a land that promised gold, battles, and probably way too much sunburn. Following his father Hamilcar and later his brother-in-law Hasdrubal, Hannibal's childhood training wheels were officially off. Iberia wasn't some quiet summer getaway. It was a wild patchwork of tribes, each with their own grudges, war paint, and really sharp spears. For Carthage, Iberia was the perfect sandbox to rebuild power after Rome had slapped them silly in the First Punic War. For Hannibal, though, it was more like a living classroom where every hill, every village, and every skirmish taught him a new lesson in survival. Marching alongside hardened soldiers, he learned to keep up, keep quiet, and keep his eyes open. He saw his father negotiate with chieftains one moment, then lead a charge the next. For a boy who had sworn eternal enmity to Rome, Iberia was the boot camp where his oath was given muscles and teeth. Hannibal wasn't just tagging along, he was absorbing everything like a sponge dipped in olive oil and blood. For Carthage, Iberia wasn't just a new territory, it was the rebound relationship after a very ugly breakup with Rome. Losing Sicily and its fleet had left Carthage humiliated, but Iberia offered riches, soldiers, and a fresh start. Think of it as the empire's glow-up phase. Under Hamilcar and later Hasdrubal the Fair, Carthage built cities, struck deals with tribes, and planted its banners deep into Spanish soil. Mines of silver poured wealth back into the city, fueling not just the economy, but also the dream of revenge. Iberia became the Barca family's playground, a place where elephants were paraded like mascots and training grounds doubled as recruitment centers. To the locals, Carthage was part conqueror, part business partner, sometimes bringing trade, sometimes bringing war. For young Hannibal, this was the stage where the theory of vengeance turned into practice. Watching Carthage dig in its heels in Spain, he understood one thing. Rome might think it had clipped Carthage's wings, but the city had simply grown new ones, and these wings were flapping loudly in Iberia. If Iberia was Carthage's new playground, then its warriors were the best coaches a young Hannibal could ask for. Forget school books. His textbooks were Iberian swords and Numidian horses. The Iberians taught him how to fight up close, fast and furious, with blades that gleamed as sharply as their tempers. Their style was wild, unpredictable, and perfect for turning skirmishes into chaos. Meanwhile, the Numidian cavalry showed Hannibal the art of mobility. Lightning raids, feigned retreats, and horses so fast they made Roman legions look like they were stuck in traffic. Hannibal absorbed these lessons eagerly, not as a bored student, but as a sponge dropped in olive oil and adrenaline. He mixed Iberian ferocity with Numidian cunning, layering them on top of his Carthaginian discipline. Every day was a masterclass in how to turn an army into a puzzle Rome would never solve. By the time he was a teenager, Hannibal wasn't just the general's son tagging along. He was becoming a walking library of battle tricks, a boy who learned war the way others learned lullabies. Just when Carthage seemed to have found its rhythm in Iberia, fate threw in a plot twist worthy of a tragic play. Hasdrubal the Fair, the silver-tongued diplomat, the empire's smooth operator, was suddenly gone, cut down by an assassin's blade. One moment he was charming Iberian chieftains at a banquet. The next moment he was headline news in the worst possible way. Carthage, far away, gasped in panic, but in Iberia the soldiers turned to the only Barca left with enough fire in his eyes. Hannibal. At barely 25, he wasn't supposed to be the one holding the reins just yet, but destiny doesn't check birth dates. The men who had watched him grow up in dusty camps, spar with Iberian fighters, and charge alongside Numidian cavalry, now saw more than a general's son. They saw a leader waiting for his stage. Hasdrubal's death was a tragedy for Carthage, but for Hannibal it was the starting gun. The oath he had once whispered as a child was about to be tested under the full glare of command. At just 25 years old, Hannibal walked into the spotlight that destiny had been polishing for him since childhood. When the soldiers of Carthage gathered to choose their new commander, the choice wasn't exactly a nail-biter. They had seen him train like a demon, ride like a Numidian, and fight like an Iberian whirlwind. The men didn't just vote with their hands, they roared with their lungs, chanting his name until the dust itself seemed to echo it. Hannibal, who once swore as a boy to hate Rome forever, was now officially the general who could make that oath bite. Wearing the cloak of command, he didn't look like a fresh-faced youth. He looked like someone who had wrestled destiny into submission. To the troops, his appointment was both terrifying and thrilling, like handing the keys of a war elephant to a man who had always dreamed of crashing it straight into Rome's front gate. For Hannibal, it was simple. No more practice rounds, no more waiting. The game was real, and Rome was already the target painted on the board. Hannibal didn't waste any time polishing his new title. Freshly appointed as commander, he decided to make his debut not with a parade, but with a brawl. Several Iberian tribes had gotten a little too comfortable ignoring Carthaginian rule. So Hannibal marched straight to their villages to remind them who was boss. His first campaign was less of a warm-up and more of a hammer-striking hot iron. He moved fast, cutting through resistance like a man who had been waiting his entire life to let loose. The Iberian warriors fought fiercely, but Hannibal showed them a style that blended Carthaginian discipline with Iberian wildness and Numidian trickery. The result? A chaotic but brilliant display of strategy that left allies in awe and enemies in pieces. Soldiers who once saw him as the young Barca now watched in disbelief as he commanded with the confidence of a veteran twice his age. This wasn't just Hannibal's first battle. It was his announcement party to the world. The oath he had sworn as a child was no bedtime story. It was now marching on the battlefield. The Iberian tribes quickly learned that Hannibal was not the kind of boss who handed out second chances. After his first campaign, survivors whispered his name with a mix of fear and awe. He didn't just win, he crushed resistance with a decisiveness that made Carthaginian veterans raise their eyebrows and mutter, "This kid is scarier than his father." Hannibal combined clever tactics with ruthless follow-through. Rebels who resisted too long found themselves staring down war elephants, and villages that dared defy him were turned into cautionary tales written in smoke and ashes. But it wasn't mindless brutality. Every strike had purpose. He wanted his soldiers to know that hesitation wasn't an option, and his enemies to understand that rebellion came with a very short shelf life. For the Carthaginian army, it was both terrifying and inspiring. They feared him, but they also trusted him to lead them to victory. In the dust and blood of Iberia, Hannibal was no longer the general's ambitious son. He was becoming the iron-fisted commander who would one day make Rome tremble. After fire and fury came something even more dangerous. Loyalty. Hannibal knew that fear alone could keep men in line, but loyalty would make them follow him into the jaws of death with a grin. So between battles, he did the unexpected. He ate with his soldiers, marched in the same dust, and even slept on the same rough ground. While other generals lounged in silk tents, Hannibal shared wine with the rank and file, cracking jokes one moment and drilling them hard the next. He rewarded bravery with gold and recognition, but punished betrayal with swift brutality. The mix of carrot and stick wasn't just balanced, it was theatrical. Soldiers felt like they weren't just serving Carthage, they were serving Hannibal himself. Around campfires, stories spread. The young commander who never asked his men to do what he wouldn't do first. By blending ruthlessness with camaraderie, Hannibal forged an army that didn't just fear him, they adored him. It was in these nights of laughter and discipline that the bond between leader and soldier became unbreakable, setting the stage for Rome's future nightmares. After stamping his authority across Iberia, Hannibal's gaze drifted farther than the next rebellious village. His eyes locked onto Saguntum, a bustling city perched like a shiny coin on the edge of Carthage's influence. The catch? Saguntum was under Rome's protective umbrella, an umbrella Hannibal was itching to set on fire. To him, Saguntum wasn't just another city, it was the perfect excuse to poke the Roman bear. Around campfires, his officers whispered nervously, "Attacking Saguntum is basically ringing Rome's front doorbell with a battering ram." But Hannibal smiled that fox-like grin of his, as if the risk was the very spice he craved. The city represented everything he hated: Roman meddling, Roman arrogance, and Roman treaties that boxed Carthage in like a caged lion. For Hannibal, the decision was obvious. To strike Saguntum was to send Rome a message. The boy who once swore eternal hatred had grown into a general ready to cash in on that promise. The chessboard was set, and Hannibal had just picked up his first real piece. As Hannibal fixed his sights on Saguntum, history itself seemed to hold its breath. This was no longer about rebellious Iberian villages or flexing Carthaginian muscles. This was the spark that could set the entire Mediterranean ablaze. Around him, his officers debated furiously. Attack Saguntum and you practically carve, "Dear Rome, let's fight again" into stone. Ignore it, and Carthage remains boxed in like a lion pacing in a cage. Hannibal, true to form, didn't see a dilemma. He saw destiny knocking on the city gates. The oath he had sworn as a child was no longer a private grudge. It was about to become foreign policy. Saguntum was more than a city. It was the fuse dangling in the wind, waiting for Hannibal's torch. The Carthaginian camp buzzed with anticipation, soldiers whispering that Rome itself would soon hear the echo of their commander's roar. As torches lit the night, one thing was certain. The boy molded by hatred had grown into the man ready to unleash the Second Punic War. And Rome? Rome was about to find out what a Barca promise really meant. The drums of destiny thundered as Hannibal marched on Saguntum, a city under Rome's protective umbrella. Everyone knew what this meant. Well, everyone except Hannibal's soldiers, who just thought they were in for another payday. Rome sent envoys wagging their fingers and muttering about treaties, but Hannibal treated them like pigeons in the marketplace, annoying, noisy, and easy to ignore. His officers whispered, "Commander, attacking Saguntum is basically poking a lion with a spear." Hannibal grinned, probably thinking, "Yes, and let's see how loud it roars." Saguntum's defenders, meanwhile, looked out from their walls and realized they had been volunteered as the opening act of history's next great war. Hannibal tightened the siege lines, refusing to be intimidated by Rome's warnings. For him, this was more than just capturing a city. It was his way of mailing back Rome's arrogance with interest. And so the first sparks flew, setting fire to a conflict that would make the Mediterranean tremble. The Punic rematch wasn't just coming. It had kicked off with Hannibal as the show's star, and Saguntum as the unfortunate stage. 8 long months later, Saguntum's proud walls looked more like Swiss cheese than a fortress. Hannibal's siege engines had hammered, burned, and clawed at the city until the defenders were running out of everything: food, weapons, even excuses. Inside the walls, people were boiling leather straps for soup, while outside, Carthaginian soldiers were betting on which section of wall would collapse first. Hannibal, ever the showman, remained calm, his red cloak flowing as if it already knew history was being written. When the final breach came, it wasn't a dramatic roar, but a weary crumble, like the city itself had finally sighed, Fine, you win. The defenders fought to the bitter end, but the outcome was never in doubt. Hannibal had turned stubborn persistence into victory. For Carthage, this was proof their young commander wasn't just bold, he was unstoppable. For Rome, watching from afar, it was the equivalent of hearing someone kick down your front door. Saguntum had fallen, and with it, the last fragile barrier between peace and all-out war. The curtain had officially risen on the Second Punic War. News of Saguntum's fall hit Rome like a thunderclap. Senators in their pristine white togas nearly choked on their figs when the messengers delivered the report. Some demanded immediate war, others tried to look diplomatic, but everyone knew the writing was on the wall. Carthage had just signed its own death warrant. In a dramatic session, Rome's envoys stormed into Carthage, faces redder than their cloaks, demanding Hannibal be handed over. The Carthaginian council, unsurprisingly, did not RSVP to that suggestion. The Romans then performed one of history's most theatrical mic drops. They pulled out the folds of their togas, declaring they carried both peace and war. Carthage could choose. Carthage's reply, "We choose war." Cue the dramatic music. In 218 BCE, Rome officially declared war, and what had been simmering resentment exploded into full-blown Punic fire. Hannibal, somewhere sharpening his plans and maybe feeding an orange to his war elephants, must have smirked. The stage was now set. Rome versus Carthage, round 2. And this time, Hannibal wasn't planning to wait politely for battle invitations. He was bringing the fight straight to Italy. Hannibal didn't wait for Rome to knock on Carthage's door. He planned to kick down Rome's own. While other generals might have prepared to defend their borders, Hannibal sketched out a plan that looked more like an epic adventure tale. Take his army, cross mountains that even goats complained about, and storm into Italy itself. Advisors gasped, scribes dropped their scrolls, and even the elephants probably raised an eyebrow. But Hannibal wasn't joking. He knew Rome was unbeatable if fought on their terms, so he flipped the board. Instead of defending Carthage's backyard, he decided to punch Rome right in the nose, thousands of miles from home. Around his campfires, he outlined his grand design with the calm confidence of a man planning a picnic, not a continental invasion. The soldiers listened, half terrified, half thrilled. They were about to become part of a march that would either make history or make funeral songs. Hannibal's eyes gleamed with the kind of fire that says, "I didn't come here to play defense. I came to rewrite the rules of war." Plans are great, but an army marches on its stomach, and Hannibal knew it. Before charging toward Italy, he had to make sure his men wouldn't faint halfway up the Alps. So began one of the most ambitious logistical shopping sprees of the ancient world. Iberian warriors with their curved swords, Numidian cavalry with wild speed, and a herd of war elephants that looked like they wandered in from a prehistoric zoo. All were gathered under Hannibal's banner. Blacksmiths hammered out weapons until sparks flew like fireworks. Granaries were emptied to fill supply wagons, and scouts ran around checking trails as if planning a hiking trip for 100,000 very grumpy participants. Soldiers polished their shields, horses snorted impatiently, and the elephants, well, they ate a lot. Hannibal orchestrated the chaos like a conductor of a particularly loud orchestra, each detail fueling the grand march ahead. It wasn't just an army being assembled. It was a mobile city with teeth, and every bite was meant for Rome. Hannibal now faced a chess move that could make or break the game. He couldn't just take everyone with him. Someone had to guard Spain, Carthage's new playground. So he handed the keys of Iberia to his trusty officer, Hanno. With a mix of solemnity and humor, Hannibal probably told him, "Keep the Romans busy, feed the elephants if they wander back, and don't break anything valuable." With that settled, Hannibal gathered his main force. Tens of thousands of soldiers, cavalry, and of course, the star attraction, his war elephants. His choice of route wasn't the easy Mediterranean coastal stroll. Oh no, he pointed at the Alps, the jagged, snow-covered spine of Europe, and declared, "That way." The soldiers blinked in disbelief, like tourists told they'd climb Mount Everest without Sherpas. But Hannibal wasn't deterred. He saw the mountains not as obstacle, but as stepping stones straight into the Roman heartland. It was madness, it was genius, and it was very Hannibal. And so the greatest road trip of antiquity began, with one army left at home and another marching toward destiny through the clouds. Marching toward the Alps was already crazy enough, but as if the gods wanted to spice things up, Hannibal's army stumbled into tribes of Gauls who were less than thrilled to see tens of thousands of foreigners tromping through their backyard. Negotiations? Forget it. The Gauls welcomed them with ambushes, arrows, and a healthy dose of chaos. Hannibal, however, thrived in chaos. While his troops scrambled under sudden attacks, he barked orders like a conductor leading a very violent orchestra. The Iberian infantry locked shields, the Numidian cavalry darted in counterattacks, and the war elephants, well, nothing clears a Gaulish ambush faster than a few tons of angry pachyderm. Still, the fighting was brutal. Carthaginian soldiers bled on narrow mountain passes, and every victory felt like buying survival on credit. Yet Hannibal never faltered. To him, the Gauls weren't just obstacles. They were warm-up exercises before the real showdown in Italy. His men, battered but victorious, realized something important. If this was just the prelude, the main act was going to shake the world. After battling Gaulish ambushes and clawing their way through treacherous mountain passes, Hannibal's army looked less like a military juggernaut and more like the survivors of a bad hiking trip. Soldiers stumbled forward with frost clinging to their beards, sandals worn down to threads, and eyes carrying that universal look of, "Why did I sign up for this?" Even the elephants, mighty symbols of Carthage's power, trudged along like oversized, sulking donkeys, their ears drooping with exhaustion. Food was scarce, the cold merciless, and morale hung by a thread thinner than a Numidian horse's rein. Yet in the middle of this misery, Hannibal's voice cut through the wind, promising them glory and riches if they could just take one more step, then another. His charisma acted like a campfire in the snow, keeping men alive through sheer willpower. Though battered and starving, the army dragged itself forward, bound together by the thought that all this suffering was an investment. The prize? Rome itself, waiting beyond the mountains. Survival became victory in itself, and every frozen step whispered defiance to the impossible. When Hannibal finally looked back at his army after the Alpine ordeal, the sight was sobering. Nearly half the soldiers who had set out were gone. The elephants that survived seemed more like walking skeletons with tusks, and the men weren't far behind in appearance. Yet despite frostbite, starvation, and enough trauma to fill several epic poems, the survivors carried themselves with a strange kind of pride. They had conquered the unconquerable. Hannibal, ever the showman, didn't mourn the losses publicly. Instead, he turned the devastation into fuel. Standing before his battered men, he declared that Rome had already lost, because no army that could climb the Alps and live to tell the tale could ever be stopped. His words, part bravado, part prophecy, sparked laughter and cheers among soldiers who only hours earlier were contemplating whether their toes would fall off. This wasn't just survival, it was transformation. The army was smaller, yes, but hardened into steel. Hannibal's genius wasn't just in strategy, it was in convincing everyone that their suffering had rewritten the rules of war. At last, after months of hardship, Hannibal's battered but unbroken army descended from the icy peaks into the lush plains of Italy. For the Carthaginian soldiers, it felt like stepping into another world. Green fields stretched before them, rivers shimmered in the sun, and food actually existed again. But beneath this relief was a thrill. They weren't just alive, they were standing on Roman soil, about to challenge the greatest republic of the ancient world right in its own backyard. Hannibal, cloak whipping in the wind, reminded his men that their suffering had a purpose. They weren't merely survivors of an Alpine nightmare. They were an avenging force. Rome, complacent and unprepared, had no idea what was about to hit it. To the locals watching these foreign troops and towering elephants march into the Italian peninsula, it must have felt like seeing nightmares come to life. And for Hannibal, this was only the beginning. Every frozen toe, every lost comrade, every drop of blood in the snow had led to this moment, a declaration that Rome would soon learn fear. Hannibal didn't waste any time after entering Italy. His first major clash with the Romans came at the Trebia River, and he was ready to show that all the Alpine suffering was about to pay off. Facing a Roman army that thought it could simply charge across icy waters and crush the Carthaginians, Hannibal had other plans. He sent his Numidian cavalry to provoke the Romans, luring them into a reckless pursuit straight into freezing waters. The Romans, shivering and soaked, stumbled into Hannibal's carefully arranged trap. Hidden Carthaginian troops, including fierce Iberian infantry and Libyan spearmen, sprang from concealment. And just when the Romans thought things couldn't get worse, Mago, Hannibal's brother, burst out from an ambush with fresh forces, smashing into their flanks. The Romans were caught like fish in a net, wet, cold, and very unlucky. Hannibal's men, though outnumbered, fought with the fiery confidence of survivors who had already beaten snow, Gauls, and hunger. By the end of the day, the Trebia ran red, and Rome had learned a chilling lesson. Hannibal wasn't just in Italy for sightseeing, he was there to rewrite the art of war. Fresh off his victory at Trebia, Hannibal decided it was time for an even grander performance. Enter Lake Trasimene, a misty Italian lake with hills perfectly suited for a giant ambush. The Romans, led by Consul Flaminius, marched confidently along the narrow path by the water, blissfully unaware that Hannibal had already turned the entire landscape into a deadly stage. Hidden in the fog, Carthaginian troops waited like actors before curtain call. As the Romans advanced, Hannibal gave the signal, and suddenly chaos erupted. Iberian and Gallic warriors poured down from the hills, Numidian cavalry charged from the flanks, and the lake itself became a trap with nowhere to escape. The Romans stumbled, panicked, and drowned by the thousands. It wasn't just a battle, it was the world's largest surprise party, except with spears and swords instead of cake. By the end, tens of thousands of Romans were dead or captured, and Flaminius himself was slain. The ambush at Trasimene went down in history as one of the most spectacularly humiliating defeats ever handed to Rome. Hannibal wasn't just a general anymore. He was officially the Romans' worst nightmare in sandals. After Trebia and Trasimene, Rome was no longer just worried. It was absolutely terrified. Hannibal had become the boogeyman of the Republic. The monster mothers used to scare unruly children. Eat your vegetables or Hannibal will cross the Alps and get you. Senators paced in the forum, wringing their hands and arguing endlessly. How could one young Carthaginian general, with a mismatched army of Iberians, Gauls, and elephants, turn the mighty Roman legions into cannon fodder? Panic spread through the city like wildfire. Whispers of spies, betrayals, and impending doom echoed through the streets. Rome had faced enemies before, but never someone who fought with such creativity, cruelty, and charisma, all rolled into one. It was as if Mars himself had taken a holiday and handed his sword to Hannibal. For the citizens, every news report from the battlefield felt like another horror story. Hannibal wasn't just outside their gates. He was in their nightmares, larger than life, a shadow cast over the eternal city. And while Rome still stood, the Republic knew one thing. The road ahead would be soaked in blood and fear, and Hannibal was just getting warmed up. After two crushing defeats, Rome finally decided, enough of charging into Hannibal's traps like moths to a flame. Enter Quintus Fabius Maximus, a man who looked at Hannibal's win streak and said, "Nope, we're not playing that game anymore." Instead of direct battles, Fabius introduced what would later be called the Fabian strategy: shadow the enemy, cut off supplies, burn crops, and basically annoy Hannibal into exhaustion. Romans nicknamed him Cunctator, the delayer, which sounded like an insult but ended up saving Rome. While impatient senators wanted glorious battles, Fabius calmly sipped his wine and explained, "You don't beat a lion by poking it, you wait until it starves." Hannibal, meanwhile, was like a party guest no one could throw out. He roamed through Italy, smashing farms, raiding villages, and taunting the legions. Yet every time he tried to lure the Romans into another trap, Fabius wagged his finger and said, "Nice try, buddy." The Roman people grumbled at the lack of action, but slowly realized, sometimes survival is victory. For the first time, Hannibal's momentum stalled, and Rome had found the one man who could make patience a weapon. Despite Fabius's frustratingly careful tactics, Hannibal didn't stomp his feet like a spoiled child denied candy. Instead, he played the long game. He let Rome think they were wearing him down while he calmly studied every hill, river, and farmland of Italy, as if writing a secret travel guide. Best places to ambush Romans. His patience wasn't passive, it was predatory. Hannibal moved his army like a cat toying with a mouse, waiting for the perfect moment to pounce. He allowed Rome to breathe just enough to stay alive, knowing that one spectacular victory could undo all Fabian patience in an instant. His soldiers, though restless, admired his confidence. When Hannibal said, "The time will come," they believed him. Meanwhile, Roman citizens, lulled by Fabian delays, began doubting whether Hannibal really was unstoppable. That was exactly the crack he needed to exploit. With a smirk, Hannibal was not discouraged by the pause in action. He knew history remembered not the delays, but the moments when lightning struck, and he was quietly charging his storm. And then came Cannae, the masterpiece that every military cadet would one day be forced to memorize while wishing they were anywhere else. Hannibal faced a Roman army nearly twice his size. Imagine bringing a knife to a sword fight and still winning. Instead of brute force, he choreographed the battlefield like a maestro. He placed his weakest troops in the center, practically waving a sign saying, "Come hit me here." The Romans, predictable as ever, charged straight in, thinking they'd finally crush him. But Hannibal had set the trap. As the center bent back like a bow, his veteran African infantry closed in from the sides, while cavalry swept around to block the rear. In minutes, the Romans were wrapped tighter than a burrito. Soldiers couldn't swing their swords without hitting their own comrades. Panic spread, and the once proud Roman legions became nothing more than fish in a net. Hannibal didn't just win, he painted a tactical Picasso on the battlefield. The double envelopment at Cannae became the stuff of legend, and Rome had never been humiliated so artistically. When the dust settled at Cannae, the numbers told a horror story even Rome had never imagined. Around 50,000 Roman soldiers lay dead, an entire generation of farmers, shopkeepers, and future senators reduced to silence in a single day. Some chronicles even suggest rivers ran red with blood, though that might have been Roman historians being extra dramatic. Survivors stumbled away in shock, whispering Hannibal's name as if it were a curse or a nightmare. Senators back in Rome tore their robes, generals blamed the gods, and commoners probably reconsidered their life choices, like why they signed up for the legions instead of selling olives. Hannibal had not just won, he had delivered the most catastrophic defeat Rome would ever suffer. The sheer scale of the slaughter turned him into a legend overnight, a boogeyman parents could use to scare children into finishing their chores. Eat your vegetables or Hannibal will get you. But behind the terror was also grudging respect. Never before had Rome's pride been cut so deep, and never had the word invincible felt so fragile. The shockwaves of Cannae didn't just echo in Rome, they rattled across Italy like gossip at a market. Cities and allies that once boasted about being Rome's BFFs suddenly started reconsidering their friendships. After all, who wanted to stay loyal to a friend who just lost 50,000 men in a single afternoon? Many southern Italian cities, along with some disillusioned allies, opened their gates to Hannibal, welcoming him with garlands, bread, and maybe a cautious side-eye. Hannibal, ever the showman, played the role of liberator, not conqueror, promising freedom from Roman taxes and Roman arrogance. The effect was electric. Carthaginian banners began to appear in towns where Roman standards had stood just days before. To the Romans, this was betrayal of the highest order. To the defectors, it was just good sense. Nobody bets on a horse that keeps tripping. For Hannibal, this swelling support was proof that his strategy was working. He wasn't just winning battles. He was unraveling Rome's network of alliances, one shaky handshake at a time. Rome, after Cannae, looked like a boxer who had just been knocked down but refused to stay on the mat. The city was shaken, allies were deserting, and the Senate must have been sweating through their togas. Yet against all odds, Rome refused to collapse. Instead of panicking, the Romans doubled down on their stubbornness, because if there's one thing Rome excelled at, it was being too hard-headed to quit. They refused Hannibal's offers of peace, executed any talk of surrender, and rallied their citizens with speeches that basically screamed, "We'll rebuild, we'll recruit, and we'll fight until Jupiter himself tells us to stop." Grain was stockpiled, new legions were raised, and even slaves were promised freedom if they joined the army. The streets of Rome buzzed with a strange mix of fear and defiance, like a city holding its breath but refusing to exhale. Hannibal had won battles, but Rome was proving it could survive disasters. What he faced now wasn't just a city, but a collective madness, a determination that made Rome the toughest opponent in history. By the end of his dazzling victories in Italy, Hannibal had become less of a man and more of a legend, a walking nightmare haunting Roman dreams. Parents probably warned their children, "Go to sleep, or Hannibal will come get you." His name was whispered in the Senate with dread, like a ghost no one could exorcise. Despite Rome's resilience, his presence in Italy was like a shadow stretching across the peninsula, making every Roman farmer, soldier, and senator glance nervously over their shoulders. Yet Hannibal never stormed the gates of Rome itself. And that hesitation became part of the myth, a brilliant predator circling its prey, but never delivering the final bite. Rome, shaken but unbroken, carried this fear like a scar, a constant reminder of how close they had come to annihilation. Hannibal, meanwhile, cemented his place in history as the man who could terrify an empire. He wasn't just a general anymore. He was a phantom, a symbol of relentless defiance, and the ghostly figure that would forever haunt Rome's collective memory. After the masterpiece at Cannae, Hannibal marched north with the confidence of a man who had just pulled off the ultimate mic drop in military history. His elephants stomped, his Iberian and Numidian troops cheered, and even the Roman countryside seemed to shiver as he approached. The road toward Rome lay open, and the eternal city suddenly didn't feel so eternal. Farmers abandoned their fields, villagers bolted their doors, and rumors flew faster than messenger pigeons. Hannibal is coming. To many Romans, it felt like a horror play where the villain had stepped right into the audience. Hannibal's soldiers marched with swagger, chanting about their victory, their eyes set on the distant horizon where Rome's walls loomed. For the first time, the heart of the Republic beat with panic, and the Senate scrambled to prepare defenses. Yet amidst this triumph, a strange tension lingered. Would Hannibal deliver the final blow? Or was Rome about to witness the greatest cliffhanger of antiquity? The march toward the gates was not just a military advance, it was destiny knocking, louder and louder. Rome had never been this terrified. After Cannae, the city buzzed like a hive under attack. Senators barked orders, citizens hauled stones to reinforce the walls, and even shopkeepers who normally argued about bread prices now argued about where to place boiling oil cauldrons. Mothers gathered their children, old men polished rusty swords that hadn't seen action since their grandfather's time, and temples overflowed with prayers louder than a football stadium on finals night. The news that Hannibal was approaching sent shockwaves. Imagine hearing that your worst nightmare had GPS and was 10 miles away. Panic mixed with grim determination. Instead of surrendering, Rome went into overdrive, hastily training recruits, stockpiling grain, and turning every street into a potential barricade. Rumors spread of secret tunnels, divine omens, and desperate last stands. But one thing was certain, the Romans were bracing for a showdown. In that moment, the mighty Republic looked less like the ruler of the Mediterranean and more like a cornered cat with claws out, ready to hiss, scratch, and bite for survival. Hannibal, the man who had just dismantled the Roman army at Cannae, now stood at the edge of Rome's doorstep. His soldiers expected the order, march forward, crash the gates, and make history. But instead of charging, Hannibal paused. He surveyed the city, arms crossed as if deciding whether to storm Rome or browse the ancient equivalent of a real estate brochure. His lieutenants buzzed with impatience. One suggested they attack immediately, another warned of Rome's towering walls and fresh recruits. Hannibal, calm and calculating, knew that charging the capital wasn't as simple as winning a field battle. Supply lines stretched thin, elephants exhausted, and the city's defenses bristled with desperate energy. So he chose patience over impulse. To his soldiers, it felt like ordering dessert and then refusing to eat it. Hannibal's hesitation wasn't cowardice. It was strategy, though one that history would debate forever. For a moment, Rome looked like a prize within reach, but Hannibal refused to gamble everything on one risky throw of the dice. His decision left both allies and enemies wondering, was this genius restraint or the first crack in his unstoppable momentum? Hannibal's hesitation after Cannae became the hottest gossip of the ancient world. Around the campfires, his soldiers whispered, "Why didn't we march on Rome? We had them trembling." Even his officers were divided. Some praised his caution as genius. Others shook their heads like gamblers who had just seen a winning hand folded. In Rome, senators couldn't believe their luck. They were sharpening swords one moment, writing farewell letters the next, and suddenly Hannibal gave them breathing space. Meanwhile, back in Carthage, armchair strategists wagged their fingers across the sea, saying, "He should have finished it right there." The missed strike would become one of history's great debates, the kind of question that makes historians rub their temples in frustration. Was it wisdom or weakness, restraint or regret? To his men, it felt like standing at the bakery, smelling fresh bread, but leaving hungry. Hannibal, calm as ever, carried on with his plans. But in that pause, Rome found a pulse, a sliver of hope. And sometimes that's all a city needs to turn survival into comeback. Rome, bloodied but not broken, finally dusted itself off and decided, no more charging straight into Hannibal's traps. Instead, they switched to the Fabian strategy, named after the man who basically invented the art of stalling until the other guy gets bored. Instead of facing Hannibal head-on, Roman generals played hide-and-seek, avoiding big battles, harassing his supply lines, and making sure their soldiers didn't end up as props in Hannibal's next masterpiece. To the hot-headed Roman youth, it felt humiliating. Are we warriors or marathon joggers? But the older senators nodded wisely, reminding everyone that survival sometimes trumps glory. Hannibal, used to Rome taking the bait, now found himself glaring at empty fields and abandoned villages. Every time he expected an ambush, there was nothing but goats. Every time he wanted a decisive clash, Rome just ran circles around him. Slowly but surely, this strategy gnawed at his momentum, like termites on a wooden beam. The battlefield shifted from roaring trumpets to quiet endurance, and for the first time, the shadow of doubt flickered across Hannibal's grand designs. Hannibal, the master of ambushes and elephants, now faced an enemy more stubborn than Roman legions, Carthage's own politicians. While he was busy shaking the Italian countryside and scaring Rome half to death, back home the Senate of Carthage was acting like a committee planning a family picnic, arguing endlessly about costs, supplies, and whether they should even send him reinforcements. Some senators worried that sending more troops would drain the city's purse. Others feared Rome's growing navy might block the path anyway. The result? Hannibal was left stranded, his grand campaign running on fumes. Instead of fresh soldiers and shiny equipment, he got excuses wrapped in official letters. To make matters worse, whispers in Carthage suggested that jealousy was at play. No one wanted Hannibal to return home too powerful. So while he was out in Italy trying to rewrite history, Carthage acted like an overprotective landlord, refusing to fund renovations. Hannibal's army began to look less like an unstoppable war machine and more like a traveling theater troupe with broken props. Victory, once so close, started to feel like sand slipping through his fingers. While Hannibal was camped in Italy waiting for reinforcements, his brothers tried to deliver the cavalry and supplies he desperately needed. First, Hasdrubal, the more practical sibling, marched an army across Spain and Gaul, aiming to meet Hannibal in Italy like a long-lost family reunion. Unfortunately, Rome had other plans. At the Metaurus River, Hasdrubal's army was crushed, and his head was sent to Hannibal's camp as the world's darkest care package. Imagine expecting reinforcements and receiving your brother's head in a box instead. Talk about ruining morale. Meanwhile, another brother, Mago, gave it a shot too. But his campaign sputtered like a broken chariot wheel. He managed some victories in northern Italy, but sickness, poor resources, and Roman persistence eventually brought him down. Hannibal, surrounded by exhausted soldiers and thinning ranks, realized he was essentially fighting solo, with Rome tightening the noose. Carthage's failure to support him properly turned his Italian adventure from a grand invasion into a drawn-out struggle. Even for a military genius, there's only so much one can do when backup keeps arriving in pieces, literally. While Hannibal was stuck in southern Italy, Rome decided it was time to take the fight elsewhere. Instead of waiting for Hannibal to knock on their city gates again, the Romans turned the tables and launched counterattacks in Spain and North Africa. In Spain, the Scipio family, think of them as Rome's ambitious rising stars, systematically dismantled Carthaginian strongholds, cutting off Hannibal's supply lines and weakening his influence. Meanwhile, in North Africa, Roman fleets began harassing Carthage directly, making the Carthaginian Senate panic more about their backyard than supporting their hero abroad. It was like Hannibal was hosting a grand party in Italy, but Rome went to trash his house instead. These moves forced Carthage to divert attention and resources, leaving Hannibal increasingly isolated. Even his legendary charisma couldn't conjure food, money, or elephants out of thin air. As Roman victories piled up, the balance of power shifted, and Hannibal's dream of crushing Rome on its home soil began to look more like a prolonged nightmare. The hunter was now slowly becoming the hunted. By now, Hannibal's once glorious campaign looked more like a long camping trip gone terribly wrong. Supplies were drying up, his elephants were either gone or retired to elephant heaven, and his troops were exhausted after years of cat and mouse with Rome. Hannibal held on to southern Italy like a stubborn tenant refusing to leave, even as Rome tightened the noose around him. The locals, once dazzled by his victories, were now less enthusiastic about feeding a massive foreign army that never seemed to deliver the promised freedom. Meanwhile, Roman forces prowled the countryside, making every harvest and supply run a gamble. Hannibal still had his tactical brilliance, but brilliance doesn't refill empty stomachs. His men fought bravely, but with dwindling numbers and growing despair. The great general who once terrified Rome now found himself clinging to survival, trapped between hostile cities, shrinking resources, and a relentless enemy. It was as if destiny had swapped his role, from predator to cornered survivor, leaving Hannibal to wage not just war, but a desperate battle against time itself. The story of Hannibal before Rome closes not with a dramatic siege, but with the quiet sound of opportunity slipping through his fingers. Once hailed as the nightmare of the Republic, Hannibal now found his victories cracking like old pottery. His soldiers were still loyal, his strategies still sharp, but the grand momentum was gone. Rome had recovered, adapted, and was now turning the tide with counterattacks in Spain and Africa. Meanwhile, Carthage remained distant, sending too little and too late. For Hannibal, every step forward seemed to meet a Roman wall, and every victory carried less weight than the crushing losses piling up around him. The man who once stood at the gates of Rome now lingered in southern Italy, unable to strike the final blow. His legend was still alive, but the dream of toppling Rome was fading fast. In the grand theater of history, Hannibal's spotlight dimmed, not erased, but flickering, marking the beginning of a long retreat that no brilliance could prevent. Just when Hannibal thought he had monopolized the spotlight as Rome's ultimate nightmare, a new character burst onto the stage, Scipio Africanus. Young, charismatic, and annoyingly brilliant, Scipio was like the fresh star actor in a long-running drama. While Rome had been battered by defeat after defeat, Scipio brought something unusual to the Roman army: confidence, flexibility, and a flair for boldness that matched Hannibal's own. He studied Hannibal's playbook as if it were his bedtime reading, memorizing every trick and trap. More importantly, he had the rare ability to inspire soldiers who were tired of losing, turning them from grumbling farmers into a motivated fighting machine. Hannibal, busy holding on to his crumbling momentum in Italy, now had to acknowledge this rising Roman rival. It was like being the undefeated champion in a gladiator arena, only to see a new challenger step in with a grin and a sword twice as sharp. Scipio wasn't just another Roman general. He was destiny's curveball, the man who would drag the war onto a whole new stage: North Africa. Scipio didn't just shine in speeches. He proved his brilliance on the battlefield in Spain. While Hannibal had once turned Iberia into Carthage's playground, Scipio came in like the new landlord collecting overdue rent. With clever maneuvers and relentless determination, he dismantled Carthaginian forces city by city, tribe by tribe. Roman legions under his command moved like a disciplined machine, while Carthaginian commanders found themselves constantly one step behind, like actors forgetting their lines in front of a hostile audience. The once solid Carthaginian grip on Spain began to crumble as Scipio combined military genius with diplomatic finesse, flipping local tribes to Rome's side. Each victory in Spain wasn't just a win on the map. It was a punch straight into Hannibal's supply chain, severing the lifeline that fueled his Italian adventure. By the time Scipio stood victorious in Spain, the message was loud and clear. Hannibal might still be terrorizing Italy, but the Carthaginian Empire's foundation was collapsing beneath his feet. After conquering Spain, Scipio wasn't content with just sending Hannibal nasty postcards. He decided to take the fight directly to Africa. Roman ships loaded with legions set sail across the Mediterranean, their sails snapping like they were heading to a festival rather than war. The landing was a bold move. For the first time in the Second Punic War, the Carthaginians weren't just hearing rumors of Roman victories abroad. They were watching the enemy march on their doorstep. Panic spread through Carthage like spilled wine at a banquet. The once proud city, which had confidently sent Hannibal off years ago with elephants and cheers, now found itself scrambling to raise defenses. Scipio's arrival wasn't just a military maneuver, it was psychological warfare. He turned the tables, forcing Carthage into defense mode and sending an urgent summons to their greatest champion. Hannibal had to come home. The Romans weren't just knocking on the door anymore. They were already stepping inside with muddy boots. The news hit Hannibal like a thunderclap. Rome had landed in Africa. For years, he had been the unstoppable storm sweeping across Italy, turning Roman generals into cautionary tales. Now, suddenly, the board had flipped. His homeland was under siege. Carthage sent frantic messengers, each one more dramatic than the last, begging their champion to return. Imagine the awkwardness. Hannibal had spent half his life marching elephants over mountains and smashing Roman armies, only to be told, "Hey, could you come back and save the house? It's on fire." He knew leaving Italy meant abandoning a battlefield where he still held the upper hand. But duty called louder than victory. Packing up his war camp in southern Italy, Hannibal prepared to sail home. His soldiers bewildered. Some even joked, "So we crossed the Alps for nothing?" Yet the general's face was set, grim and sharp. He was heading into the final chapter of his saga, back to where it all began. The hunter would now defend his own den. On the plains of Zama, destiny staged its grand showdown. Two legends of war finally came face to face. Hannibal, the veteran fox of countless campaigns, and Scipio Africanus, the rising star who had learned Rome's lessons the hard way. The moment was so dramatic that even the desert wind seemed to hold its breath. Hannibal, scarred yet proud, rode forward with the air of a man who had crossed the Alps with elephants just to make history more interesting. Scipio, youthful but confident, had the kind of calm grin that says, "I've already read the last chapter of this story, and spoiler, I win." Their meeting wasn't just about armies. It was about ideas, egos, and who history would remember as the ultimate strategist. Some sources say they even exchanged witty lines like veteran gladiators sizing up a rookie. Behind them, tens of thousands of soldiers shifted nervously, waiting for their leader's signals. This wasn't merely a battle. It was the handshake before the storm, the last polite pause before destiny swung its sword. The battlefield of Zama erupted as Hannibal unleashed his most famous weapon, the war elephants. Towering beasts adorned with armor and painted patterns charged forward, trumpeting like thunder. It should have been terrifying. Instead, Scipio's troops looked more like seasoned circus trainers than terrified recruits. With calculated precision, they opened lanes in their formations, guiding the elephants harmlessly through. Roman horns blared, confusing the animals, while javelins rained down to keep them panicked, but controlled. The mighty beasts, meant to crush legions, ended up trampling Carthaginian allies instead. Like clumsy giants in the wrong party. Hannibal's face tightened. This wasn't the fearsome stampede he had promised. It was an accidental comedy show. Scipio smirked, watching years of Rome's painful lessons against elephants finally pay off. The clash that followed would be brutal, but in this moment, the balance tilted. The weapon Hannibal once used to shock the world had been reduced to a sideshow act, and the Roman army gained the confidence of warriors who had stared down monsters and laughed. The clash at Zama ended not with Hannibal's triumphant roar, but with the groan of a broken army. His soldiers, once the terrors of Italy, now scattered across the dusty African plain, like dice tossed by a cruel gambler. Roman formations tightened around them, shields gleaming, spears advancing in relentless rhythm. Hannibal's veterans fought bravely, but exhaustion and dwindling numbers turned valor into futility. The elephants had failed, the cavalry was routed, and now the infantry crumbled under the Roman machine. Hannibal himself stood firm, trying to rally his men with shouts and gestures. But even the most loyal fighters could see the tide had swallowed them whole. By dusk, the Carthaginian camp lay silent, the air heavy with defeat. Carthage, once the proud rival of Rome, had no choice but to raise the white flag. For the first time in his career, Hannibal tasted bitter defeat, and the city he had sworn to protect was forced to beg for peace. The peace treaty that followed Zama was less a handshake and more a chokehold. Rome dictated every clause with the confidence of a victor, holding all the cards, while Carthage had no choice but to nod miserably. Gone were the vast overseas territories, Spain, islands, and more, all stripped away like toys taken from a scolded child. The mighty Carthaginian fleet, once a proud terror of the seas, was reduced to a pitiful handful of ships. Even their war elephants, the mascots of Hannibal's campaigns, were forbidden, as if Rome feared a pachyderm parade would return one day. To rub salt into the wound, Carthage had to pay an astronomical indemnity, a bill so large it made the city feel like it was being taxed for breathing. Hannibal, the man who once made Rome tremble, now watched his homeland forced to sign away its future. The empire that once rivaled Rome was shackled and the Punic lion declawed. Rome had not only won the war, it had rewritten the rules of the Mediterranean. Hannibal survived Zama, but survival felt like the cruelest joke of all. Once hailed as the scourge of Rome, the general who crossed the Alps with elephants and swagger, he now returned to Carthage more like a ghost than a hero. The people still respected him, yes, but whispers of blame buzzed louder with every passing day. Some called him a genius, undone by fate. Others muttered that he had gambled too boldly and lost everything. Hannibal himself wore the weight of defeat like an ill-fitting cloak, heavy, uncomfortable, and impossible to ignore. No longer commanding grand armies, he was left to navigate politics, debts, and Rome's watchful eye, which hovered like an overbearing neighbor peeking through the curtains. The man who once made Rome tremble now had to tiptoe around Roman envoys. His legend remained, but it flickered, dimmed by the harsh reality of failure. In the great theater of history, Hannibal was no longer the conquering actor. He was the survivor, still standing, but with his lines stolen and his spotlight fading fast. And so the curtain closed on Hannibal's epic, not with the roar of elephants or the clash of legions, but with the heavy sigh of a man who had flown too close to the sun. From the snowy Alps to the scorching plains of Zama, he had bent the rules of warfare, terrified Rome, and carved his name into history with bold strokes. Yet now, stripped of fleets, territory, and allies, Carthage limped under Roman chains, and Hannibal's star dimmed. His story wasn't erased, it became a warning, a tragic comedy written in blood and ambition. The Romans celebrated, the Carthaginians mourned, and Hannibal himself? He wore defeat like a stubborn scar, visible, painful, but proof of a life lived at full blaze. In taverns, whispers of his genius mixed with chuckles at his downfall. Because history, after all, loves irony. Hannibal had risen to the highest peak of glory, only to tumble down into bitter defeat. And yet the echo of his name continued, carried like a defiant laugh against Rome's triumph, reminding the world that even in failure, some legends never truly bow. After the chaos of Zama, Hannibal didn't just disappear into the shadows like a sulking gladiator. He staged a comeback on the political stage. Carthage, battered and humiliated, needed someone with brains, guts, and maybe a dash of flair. So who better than the man who once made Rome sweat through their togas? In a twist fit for a political drama, Hannibal was elected as the suffet, Carthage's highest magistrate. The citizens cheered, hoping their battle-scarred hero could save them from financial ruin and corrupt elites who had been feasting while the city bled. Hannibal walked into the council chamber not with swords and elephants, but with scrolls, reforms, and the sharp tongue of a man who had seen enough incompetence to last a lifetime. Suddenly the warlord had become a statesman, but the fire in his eyes hadn't dimmed. It merely shifted targets. His enemies were no longer Roman legions, but local fat cats who squirmed at the thought of losing their luxuries. For Hannibal, this was a new battlefield. No shields, no spears, just politics, and he was ready to charge once more. Once elected as souffle, Hannibal didn't waste time sipping wine or posing for statues. He rolled up his sleeves and went straight for Carthage's wallet. The city was drowning in debt from war reparations, while corrupt officials had been helping themselves to the treasury as if it were an all-you-can-eat buffet. Hannibal, ever the strategist, swapped war elephants for accounting scrolls and started slashing expenses like a general cutting enemy supply lines. He demanded transparency, audited taxes, and made sure that gold reached the state instead of private pockets. Citizens cheered as tax burdens lightened, while crooked elites discovered that their secret stashes were suddenly very public. Hannibal wasn't just balancing books, he was waging war against corruption with the same ferocity he once unleashed on the battlefield. Some joked that he made enemies faster in politics than he ever did in war. But for ordinary Carthaginians, this was a hero who had not only fought Rome, but also dared to fight the rot within his own city. It was Hannibal's boldest gamble yet, reforming a system where every coin was guarded more fiercely than any fortress. At first, the citizens of Carthage adored Hannibal's reforms. Markets buzzed with new life, merchants clapped him on the back, and farmers swore they could finally sleep without dreaming of tax collectors hiding under their beds. To them, Hannibal was not just the hero who had marched elephants across the Alps, but the man who marched corruption out of their daily lives. But in the marbled halls of Carthaginian elites, the mood was gloomier. Aristocrats, used to dipping their fingers in the public treasury like kids in a candy jar, now found their sweet supply cut off. Whispering behind closed doors, they painted Hannibal as a dangerous populace, too popular, too powerful, and way too nosy about their gold. The people cheered louder, and the nobles scowled deeper. The streets rang with chants of support, while the banquet halls rang with the sound of goblets slammed in frustration. Hannibal, ever the general, seemed unfazed, until he realized he was now fighting a battle without soldiers, where the enemy wore silk robes instead of armor. And in this new war, daggers came not from battlefields but from the polished tables of politics. The Romans, ever suspicious and never forgetting a grudge, began to eye Hannibal's every move as if he were plotting to smuggle elephants into the Senate. Reports trickled into Rome. Hannibal is reforming finances. Hannibal is popular with the people. Hannibal sneezed twice this morning. It must be war. Senators twisted their togas into knots, convinced that the Carthaginian genius couldn't possibly be satisfied with balance sheets and tax reforms. Whispers grew into debates, and debates into fiery speeches. Some Romans insisted, he's sharpening swords in secret. Others countered, no, he's sharpening pencils. But who knows where that could lead? Rome's paranoia was fueled by Hannibal's reputation. This was, after all, the man who once marched elephants across mountains just to ruin their breakfast. Whether or not Hannibal truly plotted another war, the idea of him breathing too freely made the Senate sweat. To Rome, Hannibal wasn't just a politician. He was a ticking time bomb wrapped in a statesman's robe. And as the whispers crossed the sea, Carthage felt the weight of Rome's suspicion pressing down harder than any legion. Under mounting Roman pressure, Carthage faced an impossible choice: keep Hannibal and risk another war, or send their greatest son packing. The Senate of Carthage, full of nobles who never liked Hannibal's reforms anyway, suddenly found the perfect excuse. They muttered in solemn tones, "For the safety of Carthage, he must go," though many were secretly thinking, "Finally, no more audits on our wine bills." Hannibal, the man who once terrified Rome with elephants and genius maneuvers, now stood accused of being too clever for Carthage's own good. With a wry smile, he accepted his fate. The people wept. Some shouted that Carthage was betraying its hero, but Hannibal knew resistance was useless. Better to walk out with dignity than be dragged out like yesterday's goat at the market. So the general who once shook empires quietly packed his belongings, probably sighing, All those victories, and now I lose to paperwork and politics. It was a dramatic farewell, not with swords clashing, but with the rustle of official decrees and the weight of Roman paranoia crushing Carthage's independence. Banished from his homeland, Hannibal began the strangest chapter of his life. The wandering warlord turned political refugee. Packing more strategy than luggage, he set sail eastward and eventually landed at the court of Antiochus III of Syria, the so-called Great King. The contrast was striking. Where Hannibal once commanded elephants, now he was greeted with court entertainers juggling torches. The courtiers whispered, "Is that really the man who crushed Rome at Cannae?" Hannibal smiled wryly, perhaps thinking, "Yes, and now I'm waiting in line for an audience like a merchant with overdue taxes." Antiochus, flattered to have such a legendary guest, welcomed him warmly, though behind the smiles was a calculation. Hannibal might be useful, or he might be trouble. Either way, having the boogeyman of Rome in his palace was a bragging right no king could resist. Thus began Hannibal's exile journey, not as a conqueror leading armies, but as a seasoned advisor navigating the fickle politics of foreign courts, trying to turn his legend into leverage once more. Once inside the court of Antiochus III, Hannibal wasted no time. He drew maps on the floor, sketched formations in the sand, and dramatically gestured like a maestro conducting an orchestra of phalanxes. His pitch was bold. "Your Majesty, with me as your general, will send Rome running back to their hills." The courtiers gasped, some impressed, others worried about their wine bill if war broke out. Antiochus nodded politely, but behind his regal beard, his thoughts were more cautious. Why should he hand over his armies to a foreigner, even one with such terrifying fame? Hannibal could almost hear the silent skepticism. "Yes, you smashed Rome once, but you also lost in the end." The Carthaginian general found himself reduced to a frustrated advisor, his ideas applauded in theory, but ignored in practice. It was like being the world's best chef invited to a feast, only to be asked to set the table. Hannibal's fire still burned, but here in Syria, it flickered under the heavy hand of politics and Antiochus's hesitation. The clash between Antiochus III and Rome ended in disaster for the ambitious king. At the Battle of Magnesia, Roman legions rolled forward like an unstoppable tide, and Antiochus's forces crumbled faster than a poorly baked pie. Hannibal, watching from the sidelines, must have felt the cosmic irony. He had the brains to challenge Rome, but was stuck with a commander who treated strategy like a dinner menu. Pick whatever looks tasty. When Antiochus finally admitted defeat, Hannibal packed his belongings with the weary efficiency of a man who had moved houses one too many times. From Carthage to Italy, from Italy to Syria, now it was time to start wandering again. Rome's shadow loomed over every city he entered, and whispers of, "That's Hannibal," followed him like an echo. Instead of commanding armies, the great general now had to command patience. Each failure of his allies became another nail in the coffin of his dream to bring Rome to its knees. And so, the world's most persistent thorn in Rome's side became a traveler, drifting from one foreign court to another, carrying his genius like excess baggage. After Antiochus's defeat, Hannibal turned his weary steps toward Asia Minor, searching for yet another safe haven. By this point, he could probably write a travel guide titled Exiled General's Handbook, How to Outrun Rome and Still Look Dignified. In the bustling courts of Asia Minor's kings, he found temporary refuge, but each alliance was like buying shoes a size too small, uncomfortable and bound to fail sooner or later. Local rulers admired his brilliance, but were equally terrified of Rome's long reach, treating Hannibal like a prized guest and a cursed talisman at the same time. He became a man always on the move, sleeping in foreign palaces yet never truly at home, the ultimate backpacker of antiquity. Except his baggage wasn't souvenirs, but decades of unfinished wars. Even as his body aged, his mind remained sharp, sketching phantom battle plans on parchment, dreaming of one last chance to outwit Rome. But history, like a stubborn landlord, refused to give him the keys. So Hannibal drifted through Asia Minor, a legend alive yet already half a ghost. Hannibal's journey through exile finally painted a bittersweet ending to the legend. From the heights of Cannae to drifting through foreign courts, he had gone from being Rome's nightmare to a wandering guest no one dared to keep for too long. Once hailed as the man who shook the foundations of the Republic, he was now reduced to whispers and cautionary tales told in Rome's Senate. Kings who once bowed to him now welcomed him with polite smiles, but behind their eyes flickered fear of Roman reprisal. For all his brilliance, Hannibal had become a man without a country, too dangerous to trust, yet too valuable to discard. History can be cruel like that, turning a genius into a fugitive, a lion into a shadow. And so his story in this chapter closes not with trumpets or elephants, but with the quiet image of a weary general gazing at horizons he would never conquer again. A hero, yes, but one forever branded as an outcast, the genius that even victory could not save. Hannibal's restless journey brought him at last to Bithynia, where King Prusias welcomed him, not exactly with a parade of elephants, but certainly with the sly grin of a man who knew a good bargain when he saw one. Hannibal, once the terror of Rome, now found himself in a corner of Asia Minor, trading war councils for palace dinners and battlefield commands for courtly favors. Yet even in exile, his reputation marched ahead of him. Prusias wasn't just hiring a guest, he was recruiting Rome's worst nightmare. Locals probably whispered, "Is that the guy who once scared the toga off the entire Roman Senate?" Hannibal, grayer now but still sharp as ever, adjusted to this new role with surprising ease. If Rome thought it had buried him under the weight of defeat, it had underestimated his stubborn refusal to fade. In the halls of Bithynia, the old general still plotted, still schemed, and still carried that glint in his eye that said, "I may be in exile, but I'm not done yet." It wasn't long before Hannibal proved he wasn't done playing war games. In Bithynia, King Prusias had a problem. His kingdom was being bullied by Pergamon, a proud ally of Rome. Enter Hannibal, who, despite his age, couldn't resist another chance to outsmart his old enemies, even indirectly. With a mischievous grin, he dusted off his tactical mind like a prized chessboard. Stories claim he devised a naval trick straight out of a comic book, releasing pots of venomous snakes onto enemy ships. Picture Pergamon's sailors expecting arrows and spears, only to face a slithering surprise that turned their war cries into squeals. It was classic Hannibal. When brute force wasn't enough, a little creativity and reptilian terror did the job. For Prusias, this wasn't just a defense, it was a chance to gloat. Rome may have crushed Carthage, but their friend Pergamon just got punked by an old man with a bag of snakes. Once again, Hannibal proved he could turn exile into an arena for his ingenuity. Rome, never one to let a grudge cool off, finally sent ambassadors to Bithynia with a very simple message for King Prusias: hand over Hannibal or prepare for trouble. The envoys strutted into the royal court like they were auditioning for the role of professional buzzkillers. Hannibal, of course, wasn't there to greet them. He was busy elsewhere plotting his next move. But he certainly felt the heat. Whispers filled the palace halls. Rome wasn't just hunting him. They were determined to erase his very shadow. Prusias, stuck in the middle, had the awkward look of a man trying to choose between pleasing the world's biggest superpower and keeping his best war advisor alive. For Hannibal, it was a déjà vu moment. Once again, his reputation was too large to ignore, and Rome would rather chase him across the globe than let him live out his retirement. Instead of sipping wine and playing board games, he found himself forced into a high-stakes version of hide-and-seek with the deadliest referees imaginable. Every knock on the door sounded like doom. Hannibal, once the master of ambushes, now found himself ambushed by his own paranoia. The Romans had demanded his head, and though King Prusias had not yet betrayed him, Hannibal slept with one eye open and his sandals on, just in case. Courtiers whispered, servants hesitated, and even the dogs seemed suspicious. Could his host be bought off with Roman gold? The idea gnawed at him. He paced his quarters like a caged lion, mind replaying every betrayal in history as if rehearsing his own ending. Every smile from an advisor looked like a smirk. Every toast at dinner tasted like a setup. Hannibal, who once made entire legions quake, was now battling an invisible enemy, the fear that his allies would sell him for a pat on the back from Rome. Instead of grand campaigns and elephants marching through the Alps, his days were reduced to calculating who might slip poison into his wine jug. And worst of all, he knew Rome had patience, more patience than he had nights left to sleep soundly. If Rome was plotting to snatch him, Hannibal would at least make them sweat for it. No more pacing like a paranoid old man. He rolled up his sleeves and got to work like an architect of doom. Outside his modest villa in Bithynia, ditches were dug, walls reinforced, and watchtowers popped up like mushrooms after rain. Locals joked that Hannibal was trying to turn his hideout into a mini Carthage, complete with traps only a general of his caliber could dream up. He directed workers with the same intensity once reserved for phalanxes, muttering strategies under his breath as though every stone placed was another soldier in his defense. Paranoid? Absolutely, but also brilliant. Visitors were greeted by a landscape of earthworks, spiked barricades, and hidden escape routes. Because in Hannibal's mind, betrayal was not a matter of if, but when. And while the Romans had legions and patience, Hannibal had stubbornness and a flair for the dramatic. If they came knocking, he would be ready, not with elephants this time, but with walls, traps, and enough escape tunnels to make a rabbit jealous. When the Roman net finally closed in around him, Hannibal didn't panic. He had stared down legions, crossed the Alps with elephants, and outwitted some of Rome's sharpest generals, so the idea of being cornered by bureaucrats with scrolls and soldiers with shackles almost felt insulting. Sitting in his fortified villa, he eyed the walls he had built, the traps he had designed, and the tunnels that led nowhere in particular. It was almost funny. Rome had spent decades trying to catch him, and here he was, trapped not by battle, but by politics. Hannibal reached into his cloak and pulled out a small vial of poison he had kept like an old friend. His ultimate checkmate. With a wry smile, he reportedly quipped something along the lines of, "Let's free Rome from their fears at last." He drank calmly, as if toasting his own legend, choosing to exit history on his own terms, rather than appear as a trophy in Rome's triumph. No elephants, no cavalry charge, just one last defiant act of control. In 183 BC, the story of Hannibal reached its last page. No Roman legion crushed him, no battlefield banner fell upon his head. Instead, his death came by his own hand, with a vial of poison and a final grin that seemed to mock Rome one last time. As the poison coursed through his veins, Hannibal, once the terror of the Republic, faced the inevitable with calm defiance. For decades, he had been Rome's greatest nightmare. The man who marched elephants over the Alps, the general who humiliated their legions, the strategist whose name parents used to scare naughty children. And now in a quiet room far from the thunder of war, he slipped away. News of his passing spread quickly, reaching Rome where senators finally exhaled, relieved that the shadow looming over their state had vanished. Yet for all their sighs of relief, they couldn't erase the fact that Hannibal had outlasted their rage, choosing the timing of his death himself. His final act was not surrender, but a gesture of independence, reminding the world that even in death, Hannibal refused to be conquered. When the news of Hannibal's death reached Rome, the Senate didn't throw a wild party with wine fountains and dancing senators, but they might as well have. A collective sigh of relief spread through the Republic, as though the ghost that had haunted them for decades had finally been exorcised. Hannibal had been their boogeyman, the name whispered in nightmares and in bedtime stories. Eat your vegetables, or Hannibal will come. Now with his passing, Rome felt untouchable. Senators congratulated themselves, generals claimed divine favor, and even merchants walked taller, knowing that no Carthaginian genius lurked in the shadows to disrupt their trade. Yet beneath all the pomp, there lingered an awkward truth. Rome had never truly defeated Hannibal on their own terms. He had chosen the time and place of his departure. Still, that didn't stop Rome from basking in the moment, rewriting the story as if the Republic had triumphed completely. For them, Hannibal's death wasn't just the end of a man, it was the lifting of a curse, a chance to march boldly into a future where their greatest enemy was finally gone. While Rome exhaled in relief, the mood in Carthage was the exact opposite. News of Hannibal's death hit like a thunderbolt, and the city was awash with sorrow. For many, Hannibal wasn't just a general. He was the living symbol of Carthaginian pride, the man who had dared to drag Rome to the brink of collapse. Old veterans sat in taverns, raising cups of wine with tears in their eyes, recalling the days of elephants marching through the Alps. Mothers told their children that Hannibal had not been defeated, but had simply chosen his own exit. Even the merchants, who once groaned about war-ruining trade, admitted that the city had lost its greatest shield. Statues were adorned with flowers, whispers of reverence filled the markets, and every storyteller made sure to add an extra layer of glory to Hannibal's legend. He might have died in exile, but in the hearts of his people he lived on as the eternal hero who made Rome sweat. In Carthage's collective memory, Hannibal was no tragic fugitive. He was a giant whose shadow would never fade. And so, the tale of Hannibal closes not with triumphant elephants or roaring battle horns, but with the quiet echo of a poisoned cup. His life, once filled with daring marches and brilliant tactics, ended far from home, hunted by the very empire he had once terrified. For Rome, it was the final victory. The shadow that haunted their dreams was gone. But for history, Hannibal's story didn't end in exile. It became legend. He was remembered as the man who dared to cross the Alps, who danced circles around Rome's mighty legions, and who proved that genius can shake even the greatest empire. His fall was tragic, but also poetic, a reminder that brilliance often comes with a price. Carthage lost its greatest defender, but the world gained an immortal tale of ambition, courage, and resilience. Even centuries later, generals studied his moves like musicians studying sheet music. Each campaign a masterpiece. Hannibal may have died a fugitive, but he remains forever a titan in the theater of history. At the heart of Hannibal's military genius lies the Battle of Cannae, where he pulled off a maneuver so clever that future generals would study it like a magician's greatest trick. The double envelopment, luring the Romans in, then surrounding them from all sides, wasn't just a victory, it was a masterpiece painted in dust, sweat, and Roman despair. Imagine 50,000 legionaries, confident in their numbers, suddenly realizing they were packed tighter than olives in a jar. While the Romans gasped, Hannibal's forces danced around them like a choreographed play, proving that strategy can outshine brute force. Centuries later, military academies would still draw arrows on maps to show students how Hannibal turned disaster into art. Napoleon, Schlieffen, even modern commanders have looked at Cannae like musicians studying Beethoven's notes, a symphony of timing, deception, and ruthless precision. Hannibal may not have toppled Rome, but with Cannae, he gifted the world a tactical manual still alive on every battlefield. Hannibal's brilliance didn't fade with time. It spread like wildfire through the minds of generals for centuries. Scipio Africanus, his greatest rival, admitted that his own victory at Zama was possible only because he had studied Hannibal's tricks. Fast forward to Napoleon, who was practically Hannibal's fanboy, often quoted as saying that the Carthaginian master's campaigns were his favorite bedtime reading. Even Frederick the Great and later Prussian strategists looked at Cannae as if it were a holy text, trying to bottle Hannibal's lightning in their own wars. It's as if Hannibal accidentally founded a book club for the world's most ambitious warlords. What made his influence irresistible wasn't just the scale of his victories, but the creativity behind them, turning geography, psychology, and timing into weapons sharper than any sword. From the plains of Zama to the maps on Napoleon's desk, Hannibal's ghost kept whispering to commanders, "Think smarter, move faster, and never underestimate the power of a bold gamble." If Hannibal's tactics were dazzling, then his spirit was unbreakable, a quality that even Rome couldn't stamp out. Despite crushing defeats later in life, he never played the role of a sulking loser. Instead, he walked through exile with the same iron will that once carried elephants over the Alps. Romans might have called him a menace, but secretly they respected his sheer refusal to bend. Think of it, a man who had seen victory snatched away, his homeland humbled, and yet he still schemed, still plotted, still dreamed of ways to outsmart the giant that was Rome. It was as if his mind had its own never-ending war, fueled by a stubbornness that bordered on comical. While Rome boasted of its discipline, Hannibal became the poster child for resilience, proving that a true commander isn't only measured by victories, but by the refusal to surrender in spirit. His legacy was more than battles won. It was the fire to keep standing tall, even when the world tried to crush you flat. One of Hannibal's greatest strengths was his ability to juggle different troops like a circus master. Except the stakes were life and death, not applause. He didn't just command soldiers, he orchestrated an army that looked like the United Nations of the ancient world. Sleek Numidian cavalry zipped around the battlefield, faster than any Roman horseman could dream of. Meanwhile, the massive war elephants thundered forward, shaking the ground and terrifying anyone foolish enough to stand in their path. And then there were his Iberian swordsmen, Gallic warriors, and Carthaginian veterans, all stitched together into one unpredictable war machine. While Rome relied on rigid discipline and identical legions, Hannibal embraced chaos and diversity, turning mismatched forces into deadly harmony. It was as if he were conducting an orchestra where trumpets, drums, and bagpipes all played at once, but somehow the result wasn't noise, it was victory. His genius was not only in tactics, but in understanding how to make every soldier, no matter where they came from, play their part in a grand design. If Hannibal had a LinkedIn profile, under special skills it would say, crossing mountains with elephants. His legendary march across the Alps was less of a military maneuver and more of a survival game show. Snow, avalanches, and hostile tribes did their best to stop him, but Hannibal treated obstacles like minor inconveniences. Soldiers slipped on icy slopes, horses stumbled, and elephants looked at the mountains like, "You want me to climb that?" Yet with relentless determination, and probably a lot of shouting, Hannibal pulled off the impossible. He kept morale alive with promises of Italian sunshine just beyond the snow, and somehow turned a logistical nightmare into one of history's boldest gambits. This wasn't just about reaching Rome's backyard. It was about showing that no barrier, geographic or psychological, could contain his ambition. While other generals debated supply lines, Hannibal was literally dragging elephants over cliffs, proving that strategy wasn't always about playing safe. Sometimes it was about terrifying your enemies before even swinging a sword. Hannibal never treated war as a boring math problem of numbers and supplies. It was his canvas, and the battlefield his gallery. While other generals stuck to formulas, Hannibal improvised like a jazz musician with elephants and cavalry as his instruments. He choreographed ambushes that looked like dances, turned retreats into clever bait, and made the Romans feel like they were trapped in a never-ending prank show. To him, creativity wasn't an optional bonus. It was the very essence of strategy. Each maneuver carried both daring and flair, as if he were signing his name across history with each victory. War in Hannibal's hands became performance art. Shocking, bold, unforgettable. The clash of swords wasn't just noise, it was rhythm. The movement of troops wasn't random, it was choreography. If someone had handed him paint, he probably would have painted Rome into a corner just the same. His legacy reminds us that true genius doesn't just follow the rules, it invents new ones, often while terrifying the enemy into wondering what on earth he'll try next. Centuries after Hannibal's time, his ghost seemed to wander the halls of every serious military academy. From Sandhurst in England to West Point in America, cadets pored over the Battle of Cannae like it was the ultimate cheat code. Professors with chalk-stained fingers and slightly too much coffee drew diagrams of his double envelopment as if revealing a magician's secret. Students scribbled furiously, trying to capture the essence of the man who once made Rome sweat bullets. And let's be honest, some young officers probably daydreamed about riding an elephant straight through a classroom door. Hannibal's ideas weren't just history lessons. They were templates for creativity, discipline, and audacity. Generals from Frederick the Great to Napoleon treated his campaigns like sacred texts, whispering his name with the same reverence gamers reserve for cheat codes. Even modern commanders still echo his lessons: flexibility, surprise, and turning an enemy's strength into their downfall. In the great lecture theater of history, Hannibal remains the professor whose notes everyone copies, even if they never admit he made war look suspiciously fun. If military strategy had a family tree, historians would put Hannibal right at the root and proudly label him the father of strategy. Not because he liked titles, he was more of a let my battlefield do the talking kind of guy, but because his ideas were so ahead of their time that even centuries later, generals were still quoting him like an overused meme. His double envelopment at Cannae became the gold standard, his logistics through the Alps a masterclass, and his creativity in adapting to any situation. A reminder that war wasn't just about brute force, it was chess with real consequences. Scholars often joke that if Clausewitz was the professor of strategy, Hannibal was the inventor of the syllabus. They debated his campaigns in dusty libraries, comparing notes as if cramming for a final exam on genius. Meanwhile, Rome, the very power that finally beat him, inadvertently immortalized him by obsessively studying how to never face another Hannibal again. In the end, Hannibal didn't just fight wars, he practically wrote the user manual on how to think about them. In Rome's collective imagination, Hannibal wasn't just a memory, he was the ultimate boogeyman. For years after his campaigns, Roman mothers supposedly whispered, "Behave, or Hannibal will come for you," as if he were hiding under beds rather than in exile across the sea. His name became shorthand for fear and respect rolled into one. The man who once marched elephants across the Alps just to knock on Rome's front door. Even when he was long gone, Roman senators couldn't hold a debate without someone nervously muttering, "But what if there's another Hannibal out there?" To them, he was the eternal reminder that Rome wasn't invincible. Yet, on the flip side, Hannibal's legend grew larger than life, transforming him into a mythic figure, equal parts villain and reluctant hero. The irony was delicious. Rome, in trying to bury him, ended up enshrining him as their immortal nemesis. Hannibal didn't need monuments carved in stone. The Romans themselves built his legacy every time they invoked his name in fear and admiration. As the dust of centuries settled, Hannibal's legacy marched on, far outliving the man himself. Generals studied his maneuvers like sacred texts, while cadets in military academies traced the double envelopment at Cannae as if it were a magic spell for victory. His ability to adapt, to turn mountains, rivers, and even elephants into weapons, became a timeless lesson. War was not just brute force, but an art of creativity. Rome may have triumphed, but it was Hannibal who gave them nightmares long after his death, and every empire that followed found something to borrow from him, whether it was strategy, audacity, or the sheer nerve to attempt the impossible. From Scipio to Napoleon, to modern generals with laser pointers and PowerPoint slides, his ghost still lectures about daring and discipline. In the end, Hannibal's story wasn't just about one man against Rome. It was proof that true greatness doesn't vanish with defeat. It endures, echoing across battlefields, classrooms, and the pages of history. For the Romans, Hannibal was like that terrifying neighbor who always outsmarts you at board games, except his board game involved elephants and legions. Roman writers couldn't quite decide whether to hate him or secretly admire him. On one hand, they painted him as a monster who brought Italy to its knees, a shadow that haunted their fields and families for nearly 2 decades. On the other, they grudgingly admitted that his brilliance at Cannae was unmatched, a tactical masterpiece that even their own generals studied with clenched jaws. The Roman Senate might have spat his name like poison, but young soldiers whispered it with awe, like kids talking about a legendary athlete they'll never face. This love-hate relationship turned Hannibal into a paradox in Roman history, the foe they despised, yet the teacher they unwillingly learned from. His image loomed in their speeches, their histories, and their nightmares, forever caught between fear and respect. If Roman historians saw Hannibal as a monster, classical literature turned him into something more dramatic, a walking paradox of courage and hatred. Poets and playwrights painted him as the ultimate tragic figure, the fearless warrior who dared to challenge Rome itself, yet also the eternal villain whose very name made children cry. He became a character that straddled both hero and anti-hero, inspiring awe while dripping with menace. In verses and tragedies, Hannibal wasn't just a general, he was a symbol of raw determination, vengeance, and human willpower stretched to its limits. Imagine Shakespeare writing him centuries later. Hannibal would stride onto the stage with a scarred face, thunder in his voice, and a dagger of destiny in his hand. Through the ink of ancient writers, his story became less about elephants and battles, and more about the timeless human struggle between ambition and downfall, bravery and bitterness. Literature immortalized him as both the roaring lion and the lurking shadow. Fast forward to modern times, where Hannibal is no longer just a figure in dusty scrolls, but a hot topic at academic conferences. Historians today can't resist dissecting his every move, like sports commentators replaying a game-winning goal. Some admire his genius at Cannae as if it were the tactical equivalent of inventing pizza, while others point out his strategic blind spots, like failing to capitalize on victory or underestimating Roman resilience. Debates rage over whether Hannibal was a visionary who almost broke Rome, or just an unlucky gambler who ran out of chips. Professors flash PowerPoints of elephant routes across the Alps. Students scribble furiously, and the phrase double envelopment gets repeated so often it starts to sound like a dance move. Yet one thing is clear: Hannibal isn't a relic. He's a living case study, a timeless warning and inspiration, still shaping how we think about leadership, strategy, and the fine line between genius and downfall. Hannibal didn't just march through history books, he stomped right into pop culture. From sword and sandal movies where extras dramatically faint at the sight of elephants, to novels painting him as a tragic anti-hero, Hannibal is everywhere. In some films, he's the stoic genius glaring across the battlefield. In others, he's practically a Saturday morning cartoon villain, twirling an imaginary mustache while Rome sweats nervously. Video games put him in players' hands, letting them command virtual armies across pixelated Alps. Without frostbite, thankfully. Comic books dramatize his life with capes and lightning bolts, while TV documentaries give him the slow-motion, drum-heavy soundtrack of a rock star. Even memes have had their share, with captions like, "When you cross the Alps but forget the snacks." The result? Hannibal is more than a historical figure. He's a cultural chameleon, a character who slips from history class to Netflix, from epic literature to trending hashtags, proving that legends never really retire. They just get recast with better special effects. When history nerds start ranking military legends, Hannibal often ends up at the same dinner table as Alexander the Great and Julius Caesar. And what a dinner party that would be. Alexander, the flashy conqueror, brags about building an empire before hitting 30. Caesar, always theatrical, boasts about crossing the Rubicon and writing best-selling commentaries. Hannibal, he just smirks, reminding everyone how he dragged elephants across the Alps to terrify Rome. Each man had his flair. Alexander expanded eastward with lightning campaigns. Caesar reshaped politics with charm and daggers. And Hannibal bent Rome to the brink of collapse with his daring maneuvers. The comparisons never end. Some call Hannibal the equal of Alexander in strategy. Others say he was Caesar's nightmare come true. If Alexander was the comet and Caesar the politician warrior, Hannibal was the storm, unpredictable, relentless, and unforgettable. Together they form a strange trio of geniuses, reminding us that greatness doesn't come in one size. Sometimes it's empire building, sometimes it's political scheming, and sometimes it's simply outsmarting the world's toughest republic with elephants. Even centuries after his death, Hannibal lingered in Roman memory like an unshakable nightmare. Roman parents would hush unruly children with the chilling phrase, "Hannibal is at the gates," as if the general might leap out from behind the pantry with war elephants. In Senate debates, his name floated like a ghostly presence, a reminder of how close Rome had once come to destruction. He was not just a man anymore, but a specter that haunted the collective imagination, the ultimate bogeyman in armor. Romans admired his genius even as they cursed his audacity, a mix of grudging respect and lingering fear. It was as if Hannibal had moved into Rome's subconscious, setting up camp and refusing to leave. Unlike other enemies who faded into footnotes, he became a permanent shadow in their history books. And while Rome went on to dominate the Mediterranean, the whisper of Hannibal never disappeared, hovering like a phantom over their victories. Proof that some scars never quite heal, no matter how many triumphal arches you build. At the heart of Hannibal's saga lies a timeless message. Human ambition can soar like an eagle, but it always collides with the limits of reality. Hannibal dreamed of toppling Rome, and for a dazzling moment, it looked like he might pull it off. But even the sharpest mind, the boldest march, and the fiercest elephants cannot bend history entirely to one person's will. His story reminds us that greatness is not only about victories, but also about the courage to attempt the impossible. Like a runner sprinting toward the horizon, Hannibal proved that human drive is boundless, even when the finish line refuses to move. His life became a paradox. He lost the war, yet gained immortality. The Romans built arches to celebrate their triumphs, but Hannibal built something stronger, a lesson carved into the human imagination. His legacy whispers that ambition should never be feared, only respected, and that every dreamer must accept the fine print written by destiny. Hannibal's story proves a hard truth. Even geniuses don't always win. He had elephants, brilliant tactics, and a brain that could probably outwit a chess grandmaster centuries before chess even existed. And yet, Rome endured. His campaigns were dazzling fireworks, bright, unforgettable, but destined to fade against the stubborn stone walls of Roman resilience. Hannibal became the poster child for the phrase, "so close, yet so far." But that doesn't make him a failure. If anything, it makes him more human. His brilliance reminds us that history isn't a superhero comic where the smartest strategist always gets the last laugh. Sometimes, the other side just refuses to quit. Hannibal lost the war but carved his name so deeply into memory that Rome could never erase it. His life teaches us that genius shines not in guaranteed victory, but in daring to push boundaries, even when the ending isn't written in your favor. Carthage and Hannibal, two names forever intertwined, like peanut butter and jelly, but with more spears and elephants. The city's fate is remembered through him, and his fame keeps Carthage alive in the world's imagination long after Rome turned it into ashes. Without Hannibal, Carthage might just be another footnote in Roman history, but thanks to him, it became a legend. Every time someone mentions the Alps, elephants, or the phrase eternal enemy of Rome, Carthage's name rides along. His legacy is the city's legacy, carved into stone, scrolls, and the nightmares of Roman senators. It's ironic. Rome destroyed Carthage physically, but Hannibal ensured its memory outlived marble forums and golden temples. If Rome was the empire of endurance, Hannibal made Carthage the empire of unforgettable stories. His shadow turned a fallen city into a timeless symbol, proof that sometimes memory can outlast empires. And so, the tale of Hannibal Barca closes, not with elephants crashing through snow or Roman senators trembling in fear, but with a paradox that history loves. A man who lost everything, yet became unforgettable. Rome may have erased Carthage from the map, but they could never erase Hannibal from memory. Generals for centuries studied his tactics. Writers turned him into legend. And even Rome, his sworn enemy, could not stop whispering his name in awe and dread. Hannibal stands alongside Alexander and Caesar, not because he built an empire, but because he shook one to its core. His story is not just about battles won or lost, but about defiance, creativity, and the stubborn refusal to bow down to destiny. In the end, Hannibal became more than a Carthaginian general. He became an eternal character in the theater of history. And perhaps that's the greatest victory of all, to outlive your own defeat by becoming immortal in memory.